So this is a brief introduction to regenerative grazing, and I'm going to start by just talking about what regenerative ag is as a whole. So, according to Regeneration International, this type of agriculture describes farming and grazing practices that, among other benefits, reverse climate change by rebuilding soil organic matter and restoring degraded soil biodiversity, resulting in both carbon drawdown and improving the water cycle. So we are using grazing practices in this case to really help build our soils. So while we are wanting to feed livestock or other animals with our pasture, we are really just using those animals as a tool um, to really uh, to really improve our soil health and soil biodiversity. So other practices that would also be considered regenerative to kind of give you an idea of the kind of sphere that we're talking in would be aquaculture, um, agroecology, agroforestry, composting, any sort of planned grazing, no-till or reduced tillage practices, pasture cropping, perennial crops, and then also silvopasture, which we'll talk mostly about grazing planning and then also a little bit about silvopasture as well. So regenerative grazing, just to get started here, and I will share the results of the poll. So just so everybody can kind of see those. So regenerative grazing really, it is, you know, more of an adaptive system. It seems like a lot whenever you first hear about it because usually the main component of regenerative grazing is frequent moves, anywhere from 1 to 3 days that you're moving those animals from field to field. So it seems a little bit daunting at first, but we're kind of going to dig into what it is, why you would use it, and then also kind of how you get started with some fencing, water, and pasture system basics. So kind of to get started here, regenerative grazing is, like I said, a tool that can address multiple goals or issues at the same time. So we are going to be feeding our livestock. So anytime we're moving through a pasture, we're offering foodstuffs to our livestock, manure distribution. So when we are keeping animals in a dry lot or a permanent pasture, manure can kind of build up, and then we may have to do something to distribute that or spread that out and put that nutrients back into the soil. But with regenerative grazing, we're moving the animals frequently. We see a much more even distribution on manure and animal waste. And again, we are also working to improve our soil health, which in turn improves the quality of our forages, of our grasses, and also improves the water holding capacity of our soils. So the key to regenerative grazing that makes it a little bit different than traditional rotational grazing is that word adaptive. So we have a plan, a general idea of what we're going to be doing and issues that we would like to address, but we need to focus on being adaptive as well. So you want to keep good records, know where you've been, where you started last year, and so that way you can alternate the grazing period. So if we started in paddock 1A in the spring last year, we don't want to start there again this year for a couple different reasons that I'll kind of address. But we're going to work on alternating that grazing period, which means the time that the animals are there, but then also the intensity. So the amount of animals that are there in a given space. Again, we're going to move in different patterns, and then we're going to change our stock density or basically the amount of livestock pounds per acre or per square foot of land. So it's a variable system, which does allow us some forgiveness in our system and be able for us to adapt as well. So weather, seasonability, family, and pasture differences are all going to play a big role in how adaptive we are and the kinds of things that we're able to do. So if we have an area that is typically very wet and then we get a very big rain just before we move into that paddock, we may not want to move there. We may either want to hold the animals, or we may want to change the direction that we were going, if that allows us to be able to do that. So that way we're not damaging that particular area. Seasonality is another big one of our bigger hurdles to address whenever we talk about grazing. Um, in those months of anywhere from November to February, it tends to get very cold and very muddy, especially on the edges. Sometimes in December, January, even into February, the ground freezes, and so we have less issues with mud. But especially in November and March, when things are starting to freeze and thaw and then thaw out, we can see a lot of mud issues. And so sometimes we have to choose what we call a sacrifice area, or really frequently move the animals to help prevent creating more problems. Then you're also going to see differences in your pastures. You may have some areas of your paddock or pasture that have a particularly high concentration in one area of a grass that the cows really like. And so, or your sheep or goats or even horses, and you might want to graze through that in such a way to avoid giving too much damage to one area. Shady spots also can be areas of congregation and traffic. The animals will go there in the middle of the day to rest, but they can really cause a lot of compaction. And so we want to be mindful of differences and variabilities within each of our individual pastures and paddocks. So we are really going to use observations to make good decisions. So there are a couple of tools that can be used to help gauge how long pasture rest periods should be, animal health, and the amount of leaf material that's still on the plants. But a lot of this, especially once we get started or have some experience with it, you can kind of tell, both within animal health. Do the animals seem content? um, if you maybe didn't give them enough pasture for the day, they're probably going to be standing at the edge of the fence, making noise when they see you, um, or even, they might appear restless. You might have animals getting out. Um, or if you gave them too much space, then they might not be ready to move when you wanted them to. And so those are just some observations to be made as well. So this is a really good graphic that I love. And what it shows is kind of the manure distribution in different grazing systems. And it also just kind of highlights the way that these systems look as well. So in a continuous grazing or permanent pasture system, we typically see that the manure distribution and concentration is very high in places where the animals tend to congregate. So in this case, in this paddock, in this pasture, you can see that we have our water site here in the corner. So the animals spend a lot of time there for water. We could also see similar patterns, like I said, around shelter, hay areas, things like that, where they're going to tend to congregate. And then it's not very evenly distributed because the animals spend the least amount of time furthest away from the water. And you will also see their grazing patterns kind of almost mimic this, or not really their grazing patterns, but their damage level kind of mimic the way the manure distribution looks like. You'll tend to get bare spots and things around water areas. In a traditional rotational grazing system, so kind of a fixed system with a scheduled move um, of about once a week or more, um, they are going to move through the paddock. So we are going to see some rest period for each paddock, but it's maybe not going to be as long as some of those forages need to really come back and be as productive as they could be. And the other thing that we see again with these fixed water systems is that they are going to have some more concentrated manure distributions again. So adaptive grazing or regenerative grazing, so I kind of use that term interchangeably. This is going to be once daily or even more moves depending on what your goal is. But it's really going to be based according to your observations, your goals, your needs, and objectives. So you can really vary that paddock size, which changes the density of the animals on the area. And we will talk about this more, but watering systems do tend to be one of the most limiting factors with adaptive grazing. But you can see here that we're getting a much more even manure distributions because as we move through this paddock, the animals are moving in different patterns, um, and they're also kind of moving quickly through the field, and so we're not seeing a buildup of manure in one particular area. So regenerative adaptive grazing is really trying to use our observations to determine our decisions. So if we notice that we have that we're having issues with spring weeds, and we have been starting in paddock A every time in the spring, um, you might have more weed pressure different times. And so using those observations to really determine those decisions, which um, everything I'm telling you is kind of the framework and the idea of regenerative grazing. But every farm that I've visited that does this does it in a slightly different way. And all of it's okay. It's just whatever fits your system the best. Is so it's really is kind of very observation based and very unique to the farm um, that that is using this system. So these are all kind of pillars of regenerative grazing, though. So they all typically have more frequent moves than traditional rotational grazing. Um, this is based on what they often refer to as mob grazing. So it's more of a high density, but the animals aren't staying there for very long. This can sometimes also, they will occasionally move the animals more than once a day, but once a day is typically the standard. The other thing you can do, I've seen farms that graze lambs and they only move their lambs every 3 days. I've seen farms that move their lambs every day because they're with their cattle. So it really does depend. But the most important thing is we're allowing that soil to have a break and to have a rest, the grasses to have a break to grow and regenerate it um, before they are back in pasture. So we are really using, again, I keep kind of coming back to this, but animals are going to be used as a tool to promote soil health. So our animals are helping to aerate the soil, they are putting nutrients back into the soil, and they are a little bit of disturbance to the soil is a good thing. It helps uh, promote the microbiology of the soil and really get all of those organisms kind of going and charged up. And when we have a diverse system, that will just add to kind of the rich life that's under the soil. And so the animals are a really important tool to us to help build our soil health. Another key pillar is focusing on providing adequate rest to our pastures between the grazing periods. So that's where when we break the paddocks into really small paddocks, it helps prevent the animals from being overly selective in their food sources. Because if we have a large area and they're allowed to do what we call back graze, or to in a maybe a traditional rotational system where they're there for a couple of weeks, they find their spots where the good stuff is at, and then they eat that to the ground, and then they leave the less desirable stuff. Um, and so with frequent moves, we offer longer rest periods, which is really good for the grasses and our other forages to regrow. Um, the other thing that these animals do, especially when we move them in kind of a higher density, is they're eating a lot of the grass, but they're also trampling it, which is good too. So they're doing some trample as well. And depending on your goals, that can be a really good thing as well. The other thing is always having a backup plan. Especially in the winter time or in the springtime, if you're trying to graze all year round or have animals in pasture all year round, it can be really important to have a shed or a lot to hold the animals during big rain events or snow events. Or if you're going to be feeding a lot of hay, that can be another time that you'd want to hold them in one area. So this can be a lot that again we kind of refer to as a sacrifice area, where we're kind of concentrating the damage and not allowing it to ruin some of maybe the fields that we're trying to rebuild. So this is one of my favorite graphics, and in fact, I think I have another graphic that's very similar coming up because I love this idea so much. So when we look out across our pastures, usually when we look at how short or tall the grass is after the animals have been there, we're looking at it from the standpoint of above the surface and what that means for the animals to eat it. But the what we really should also think about is what's going on below the surface. So we typically, the old adage is, and still very true today, take half and leave half. So that seems like a lot to leave behind. And when you first see it, it looks like, they could stay there for a lot longer than that because there's still so much grass. But when we take, anywhere from 10 to 40% of the plant above ground, we aren't doing anything to slow the root growth below ground, which is good. When we take about 50% of the above ground plant material, it only slows the roots down by about 2 to 4%. But when we take another 10%, so when we take 60% of the plant, we are damaging and slowing the root growth by about 50%, which in turn slows the plant's ability to pull up nutrients and water. So if we have a drought event, that plant is going to suffer more severely, and it's going to take longer for it to come back from that drought event than it would if we had stopped at 50%. Um, and it's really important that we strike a balance. So it's okay to go ahead and take up to that 50% because we do want to feed our animals and provide them with good quality forage, and the plants can regrow from this amount of damage without too much issue. So while this is an older graphic, it's still a very good, very true graphic, and I really like to talk about it. So why regenerative grazing? I've kind of talked about what it is, but then also wanting to talk about why we would do this. So it really improves our soil function, as I've talked about. It with the amount of roots and then also a lot of our microorganisms in the soil, some of them produce kind of usually in the soil world kind of called it the glue, and it helps with the build soil structure and help all of those little soil particles stick together and allow for lots of little channels and runs for the water to be able to move through. And that really, um, for one thing, it increases the holding capacity of the soil so that water is there for those plants when they need it. But it also helps reduce water runoff, which, as we know, moving water can cause issues of erosion. You can see channels and fields and things like that. So we can reduce our water runoff by having better soil structure, and then also by having roots in the soil which help and cover above the soil to help protect it from that like impact of rain splash. So this is really good for our water management. You can reduce your input costs if you have a farming operation or even like a large scale garden or pasture. You can help reduce input costs by using regenerative grazing because again, we're spreading manure evenly throughout the field. We're adequately resting our grasses so we're not stressing them out to the point where we need to put on lots of nutrients or amendments. Um, this can also be really beneficial if regenerative grazing is often incorporated in row crop operations as well, and so it can help reduce additional nutrient inputs as well. So when we graze this way and allow adequate rest to our grasses and other forage plants, we're increasing the nutrient quality of those plants as well, because healthier plants are going to have better quality forage, which in turn is going to be better for our animals. So healthier animals, when we're grazing them and they're out on pasture and they have really high quality food, they're going to tend to be healthier, um, and be a lot happier and able to move around. And so this is a really good system for that. In the cases of less profitable land, so maybe in areas that are more prone to flooding or have poor quality soils, we can still oftentimes graze those and use them for a potential profit, whether it's grazing cattle or sheep or goats or something through those areas. Other less profitable areas might be wooded areas, things like that. We can use this system because it's so adaptable to make use of our land. This also really allows us to diversify our operations. So we are doing multiple things with our land. So we might have a large garden or a field that has crops in it certain times of the year, and then we put down a cover crop. So we plant some sort of grass or mixed forage, and then we graze cattle or sheep or goats or even chickens through that. And so we're really diversifying our operation. And then again, stewardship. So we are trying to, by having a healthier soil environment and controlling our water runoff, we are providing ourselves with a better operation, but then we are also being good stewards to the land. So this is another, this is kind of an agronomic example, but would also apply to any sort of like monocropping system. So if you have a garden or something as well, this would be a similar idea. So when we have a monocrop system or a single crop in the ground, it doesn't promote as many different organisms in the soil. So there are only certain types of organisms in the soil, and the root systems are very much the same. So if we have a corn plant, for example, that root system looks a certain way, and it has a certain host of microorganisms and things that move through there. And then we harvest it, and then we leave the soil bare. That allows for the sun to beat down on it and can get too hot. It can also, we can have water runoff issues and erosion issues. And then if we are incorporating a cover crop into our system, we can see some benefits because now we've added some diversity. So we're improving our soil health. We have the ground covered and protected, but we aren't necessarily using that to the fullest extent by incorporating an animal into it. Because what we can do with our cover crop then is we can have our cash crop, plant a cover crop, and then allow the animals to feed on the cover crop, which in turn then would convert that cover crop into some revenue of a livestock animal. So we've kind of talked about why you might want to use this system and why it would be good to incorporate, but we can really kind of dig into getting started grazing. So fencing, which I saw wasn't a huge concern in our poll, but so I'll spend a little bit of time talking about it, but then I'll try to focus a little more on the watering systems and the pasture types. So fencing, we have a lot of options, and depending on the class of livestock that we're looking to graze, it can be pretty simple to somewhat more complicated. So typically you can build your entire fence, especially if you're getting started on a fairly small scale. You could use polywire or electric netting. So that can be purchased at any local farm store. There's several good resources online as well for getting this kind of equipment. But this would be your portable fencing for your interior fences where you're doing your daily moves. But you could also make your perimeter fence out of this if you don't already have a perimeter fence, which would be a permanent fence, usually like a 5-wire high tensile fence is going to be your outside fence. And then you're most likely going to want some step-in posts. So like the fiberglass step-in posts that you see from the farm store. There are also some better options if you get into it more heavily. There are lots of different fence post options out there, and everybody has their favorite, and so it just kind of depends on the person and the class of livestock that you're grazing. Cattle, even though they would be the biggest animal, are going to be the easiest ones to keep in. Goats are probably your hardest animal to manage and keep in a fencing system. And then chickens, there are several options for them as well. Fencing reels. So for your poly wire or your poly tape, um, the best way to do that is to have that on a reel. There is everything from a cheap generic reel to really fancy ones that are geared that you can operate with a drill, so it goes really fast and you can roll up a lot of fencing really quickly. I will say with any kind of fencing that's going to be using electric wire, having a really good fence starter is going to be your best friend. So some of these other things you can kind of get a little bit cheaper or on a budget and then improve later as you build your operation. But I would say having a good fence charger is a must, um, because that's what you're going to depend on to keep your animals where they belong. And then in the case of your smaller livestock, so chickens or even sheep and goats, it's going to help with keeping predators out. And then again, having a good perimeter fence. So if you plan on using all portable temporary fencing for even your perimeter fence, you might add a couple extra strands of wire on the ones that are the perimeters, especially if you're near a road or have close neighbors, so that way you're not um, creating problems that way. But eventually, I would highly recommend to trying to upgrade to a good quality perimeter fence. Shelter. Some animals need this more than others. For example, if you're doing laying hens, a shelter is pretty much a must. You need somewhere for those chickens to be able to go to lay their eggs where you can collect them, and then you also want to be able to protect them at nighttime. So having some sort of mobile chicken coop for them to be able to shut them in at night is going to be really important. Um, some of your some livestock are going to be more tolerant of hot days than others. And so if you don't have a lot of shade, you may want to provide some sort of shade or shelter for them. Some of them don't really need it. There are some of the breeds of cattle that have been bred specifically for grazing, and they don't um, they can withstand the heat a lot better. So it really just depends on the animals and if um, how much shade they're gonna need. Water. Water is often our most limiting factor, especially depending on the scale that we are focusing on. Excuse me, I had to get a drink. Um, so there are a lot of portable options as far as um, it kind of you're just limited on your creativity and your time if you're making a portable system. So it can be something as simple as having a tank that you move every time you move the animals, and then having a watering tank on a side by side or a four wheeler, and then filling it. Um, you can also allow for maybe alleyways or aisles to fence to allow the animals to have access to the water source if it's a permanent water source that cannot be moved. So again, watering sources can be somewhat limiting. And if you have specific questions, you could feel free to drop those in the chat and we'll answer them at the end. So this is one that I really like to talk about, watering and food systems. So this is from a farm. It's called Main Street Pastures. They're over in St. Rose, Illinois, but they farm and use cover crops, and they run regenerative livestock. So this little skid here is their mobile feeding station for their laying hens. And so this little tank up here on the right hand side is the water tank, and they turn that on and then it fills the two hanging waters, and then the big thing in the middle is the feeder. And so that they just pull that every time they move their broiler house. So this picture was taken in, I believe, February. Um, and you'll note that they did have some electric netting up, and that was mostly a reminder for the chickens, and then also kind of a deterrent for the pests, predator animals. This here is a what we call a chicken tractor. It's one of the larger, more elaborate ones. Um, but this is on a skid system and they pull it with a small tractor, and then it also has feeders in it as well, feeders and waters. In the wintertime or in the springtime and summer, they keep all of their broiler chickens, their meat chickens in here. And I don't believe they allowed them to free range, so this door would be shut, but these are their laying hens. This is an example of a smaller chicken tractor that I believe they also would keep turkeys in as well. And so that's some different examples of kind of ways to contain the animals and also to allow them to move around. So here are a couple of different pictures of fencing options. So in the left-hand picture, all of these are different temporary fence posts. So just the fiberglass posts that you step into the ground. One thing to look at if you're looking at purchasing some of these would be looking at the UV resistance, because these will break down over time being in the sun. And especially some of the cheaper ones, can have splinters and things. So you do want to be aware of that. There's also another popular one that I see quite frequently that is called a pigtail post. And so it's usually just a metal post with a little like curlicue at the end where the wire sits, and it has like a protective rubber insulator on it so that it doesn't ground the electric charge. But pigtails are an option as well. If you're grazing smaller classes of livestock, you're probably going to be running more than one strand of wire. So something like these step-in fiberglass posts is going to be your best option. These are the reels that I was talking about. And so they have poly wire on them and then a handle and the reel. All these reels hold different amounts of wire based, measured in feet. And they have a crank on them. You can get, if you're going especially long distance and pulling lots of wire, you can get ones that are geared reels. And so every time you crank the handle, it does 3 revolutions, for example. And so that way you're not doing quite as much work. In the top right hand, we have our electric netting. People that I know that use this all say that it's great, but it's a pain in the rear to put up. So it is often something that they will not move quite as often, or you want multiple people to help move it because it can be, it tangles easily and it's just a little bit more difficult to move. Another point that was made was in the middle of summer, if it has been dry, these little posts are really hard to drive in the ground. So that's something to keep in mind. I saw this recently used in a rotation where they had sheep and turkeys and they were only moving them once every 3 days. And so they were using this electric netting and it worked well, especially because they weren't moving it every day. On the bottom right hand side is an example of what permanent or perimeter fencing might look like. And so this is a corner and the way that these are supported. So if you are going to build perimeter fencing, you want to make sure that you are doing it the right way and following like Illinois fence law and things based on the height, so that way if this is especially important if you're near a road or neighbors or something, so that way if something were to happen, you're not liable. So this is an example. This is from a farm in Dahlgren, Illinois, and they have sheep and cattle, and they also have some pigs as well. But this is the 2-strand fence that they run to keep their sheep in. They said they do occasionally have issues with lambs getting under it, but they have perimeter fencing as well. So this was just an in-between layer. What I wanted to showcase though in this picture is the watering system. So they had water fairly close by. So this is a float valve, and then this is a hose that runs to the tank. And so the float valve kicks the water on, and then it automatically waters the animals, which is great and can work really, really well for a system. The only issue sometimes is if the float valve were to get stuck either open or closed, because if it were open, then the tank could overflow. And if it were closed, the animals may need water and not be able to get it. So float valves are a really good option. And what they would do when they would move the animals to a paddock is they would have hoses. They'd have their water spaced I believe they had watering spigots every so many 100 feet. And so then they would move as far as that hose would go, and when they'd switch over to the next permanent watering source to be able to water the animals. Again, this is another picture of the same farm. Couple of things to note about this one. This is some silvopasture, so it's in a wooded area, and they're moving the animals through. And the animals here are feeding on a mineral block, so that's something also often that you want to offer to your livestock if they're exclusively grazing and getting no grain is a mineral block. Make sure that you are providing them with the appropriate minerals for them. So um, sheep, for example, are highly sensitive to copper, so you'd want to offer them a sheep-specific mineral. So pasture systems. So there are a lot of different options for pasture. Annual pasture, something that we seed every year, is an option. Perennial pasture, so kind of what we think of as like our classic, lush green field. Perennial pastures can take several years to establish and are something that we want to kind of work towards maintaining as well. But they are really great, especially in drought years and things, because they're going to be more tolerant and have deeper root systems, more established root systems. Grazing cover crops. So this is a really good option, especially if you have a row crop field. But again, you can incorporate cover crops into an annual pasture mix as well. So oftentimes they will graze the corn stalks afterwards, but they may have also gone through and planted several different cover crops. I know one grazer that had I can't remember if it was tillage radishes or some sort of turnip that they planted, but the cows would actually dig those up in the wintertime and eat them. And so that's an option as well. So again, you can graze after the harvest of a cash crop, and you can also graze in wooded areas or trouble spots. So you can actually kind of use, especially multiple classes of livestock to really help knock back trouble areas. So when we're talking about like a wooded area where it might be difficult to go in and clear brush out, you can fence the animals in there and allow them both through trample and also grazing to help kind of manage some of your spots. It may take a little bit longer because you can't leave them there indefinitely, but as you move them through throughout a couple of seasons, you're going to see a big difference and improvement. So one thing with being really adaptive is being able to take advantage of all the opportunities that we have. So the left-hand picture is what I was talking about earlier with the animals grazing in a previously harvested cornfield. And so they're picking up all of the extra corn cobs that might have been left behind, any dropped seeds, but they're also eating some of those corn stalks as well. And the right-hand side, this is an animal. This cow is in a cover cropped field, and they have some forage available to them as well. And so really being able to take advantage of our opportunities. In the past, I've talked to grazers that have said um, they had a cover crop planted out and they had intended to go through and either spray that cover crop with a chemical burn down or roller crimp it, which is where you bend the stem and that kills the cover crop. But for some reason, they were unable to get in the field. And so they turned their livestock into the field, and that created trample. So it knocked down the cover crop. They grazed on the cover crop, and then they also left behind their manure. And so being really adaptive and using those opportunities can be really helpful in these systems. So this is an example of silvopasture. So in the left-hand side, this kind of background picture, this was taken in February, and then this picture on the right-hand side is the same area whenever it's in like peak grazing. You can see how much forage was kind of left behind here in the wintertime, and then how green this area was. The grazer that owns this land was saying that he did go in and clear out some trees to allow the light through, but then all of the grasses and forages that grew up there were already in the seed bank. So he didn't plant anything or put down any grasses. This is what was there and then came up whenever he allowed enough light through. Another thing that you can do if you're trying to seed pastures You do want to be careful, but you can unroll hay and then the animals will pick through the hay, but then any seed heads will fall out of the hay and then regrow. So you do want to be careful with that and choose good quality hay because you can bring in good seed that we want, but you can also bring in weed seed that we don't want. And so that's something to keep in mind as well. So this is kind of a unique thing that I've seen with grazing. I believe he was also rotating his pigs once every 3 days. They were moving the pigs. This particular picture, they had actually been held in this area a little bit too long, but they were waiting to send the animals to market and they didn't want to move them again. And they were also, it had been a series of really hot days and they were trying to keep them in the shade, so they kept them in one particular location. What this particular farmer was doing was allowing the pigs to go through kind of a trouble area and root up the ground and work up the ground, and then coming behind them with a mixed cover crop, planting that. And so they were kind of using the pigs as like free tillage and then moving them on through. And with this, then they were able to come behind the pigs and graze the sheep and the cattle on the cover crop. And so it's a really great system that kind of allows some balance. You do want to be really careful with pasture pigs because of the amount of damage that they can do to trees and to the soil. They can create wallows. So you want to be aware of that, but it can be a really interesting and kind of another animal to diversify the system with. But you want to do your research before you try to introduce pigs into a pasture setting. So with regenerative grazing, we want to keep in mind that we only have control of so much. So what we can control is the timing, so the amount, the length of time that the animals are there. So whether that's 1 day or a week, the frequency with which they visit that field. So maybe they're there once every 45 days or 60 days. It just depends on how we set up our rotation and what our goal is in that area. And then the duration. So how long we leave them there. Again, and the duration also being how long they're in a particular area. And then intensity. So the amount of livestock that are the pressure that they're putting on that. So we can increase intensity, for example, by putting 10 animals in a fairly small area. That's going to be much more intense to that area than if we had 10 animals in an area 2 to 3 times that size. And so we might want that really high intensity once in a while to fix certain problems or to kind of stimulate the area. It just really depends on what our goal is. So here are the pigs again, but I do want to showcase their water system as well. So they had a similar float system, but then this had you can't see it in this picture, but lower down there is a place that allows the pigs to drink. So kind of a flap that they can flip up with their nose. The grazer did say that sometimes they have issues with them sticking that flap up and either flooding it or messing with the float valve, and then they're not able to get water. So just being mindful of the system that you have and the animals that you have, so that way you can kind of check on them more frequently, for example, and make sure that they are doing what they're supposed to. But you can see how they've done this area to kind of the bottom of the screen is where they had been, and then this area is where they had been for a week or two, and you can see where they have kind of been rubbing and itching on that tree, and so that's not ideal. And the grazer noted that, but he was holding them there, and so that again was kind of a sacrifice area. So, but all things to really keep in mind. So this is an example of broilers on pasture. So these are Cornish crosses, and there are lots of different options for these chicken tractors and A-frames. Some of them are very short and low to the ground, but that can be difficult for changing food and water, as well as getting in there to actually collect the birds. But these have a very short turnaround time. I want to say it's somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks from the time they get the chicks to the time that they're ready to harvest them, and send them to market. And so chickens, broiler chickens, pasture-raised chickens can be a really great option. Now, one thing to note is that chickens and pigs as well cannot get all of the nutrition that they need from the grass alone. So you will have to offer supplemental feeding to these animals, but they can be really valuable in the process of kind of restoring our pastures and adding to diversity. So again, one of my favorite graphics are these ones from the Pasture Project. But so again, continuous grazing is kind of where the animals are there either all year round or in the same spot most of the time. We don't have as many animals on the landscape in a continuous grazing operation because we want to spread it out so that way they have enough forage for the whole year. So we aren't going to very intensely stock that area, or what we call livestock density. With a rotational grazing, we can add a few more animals because we are going to be able to keep them away from certain areas to allow those to regenerate. But we are still moving in kind of the same pattern, and the animals might still be in the same area for a couple weeks. So they can still kind of be regrazing choice plants and not grazing others or not trampling others like we would want them to. And with adaptive or regenerative grazing, we're often grazing more animals in a kind of a smaller space, but we're moving them more frequently, which can increase our trample and really knock down weeds and other grasses and provide good cover. And then also, we are offering a lot more rest to the other parts of the pasture that the animals can't get to. So this is just another example of an area with stockpile grazing. So that means that they, or stockpiling forage. So this was in about February. And there's a lot of pasture out here, a lot of grass left. So they took the animals off of that in the fall to preserve that amount of forage. So when they turn the animals out in the spring, there's already some grass there for them to eat. And then as there's more grass growing. So the animals will also eat the more brown parts of the grass, what we kind of think of as less desirable. But they do need that to help balance their diet, especially in the spring, because when we think about fresh spring grass, whether that's cattle or sheep or goats or horses, sometimes they can have issues with grass early in the spring. And so by leaving some of that older forage there, the animals will be able to balance their diet a little bit better. So again, I want to kind of remind and talk again about this take half, leave half concept. So it's the same graphic as we talked about earlier, but another thing with stopping the animals from grazing at a certain level, this can also help with our parasite issues, particularly in sheep and goats, for example, because the parasites are all in the first, so the bottom 4 inches of the plant and lower and along the soil surface are where a lot of our parasitic worms and things are at. And so if we stop the animals from grazing that low, they aren't getting to the majority of those parasites. So they might still have some parasites, but this is going to help and be kind of a natural way to prevent them from getting parasites in the first place. So the next step, so this is just kind of an introduction to the grazing process and to kind of just bring it to the forefront. But you want to consider your goals. What are your goals for your land? What are your goals for yourself? Are you somebody who likes to take frequent vacations? So the permanent pasture thing works really well for you because you don't have to rotate the animals. You're not there. You might be able to rotate, but rotate less frequently. There are some fancy contraptions called bat latches that are automatic release gates. And so you could have 2 or 3 moves set up in advance and then set a timer, and those latches will open on their own, and then the animals can move through. You could, if you were, for example, planning a vacation for a week, you could structure your paddock that you're going to move into so that it's large enough to accommodate the animals for a whole week, and then you're good to go. Um, it offers another rotation option for if you're a crop field or even a large garden, um, and you want to be able to rotate and have other sources of income. This is another option that still keeps the land productive, but isn't a monocrop system. You can also use this as a way to bring in the next generation of farmers and gardeners, um, because you can really have your kids and your family involved, and it kind of can ease that transition where you can also maybe rent a few acres to someone else for them to be able to graze and use that land. Maybe you have land and you're done using it, but you don't want to sell it. So this can be an option to allow someone to graze, or for you yourself to graze, and kind of help incorporate the next generation. My recommendation would always be to start small because you can always add more as you go, but it's a little more difficult to downsize if you went too big. So I would start small and then just kind of experiment and really find out what works well for you. Because again, this is adaptive management. And so we can also use that to adapt it to ourselves and make it work well for us. So I just want to quickly say thank you to Ted Crosskoff. He's from Hickory Flat Cattle Company. I've visited his farm a couple times and they have a really great system. And then again, Jill from Main Street Pastures. I also want to mention Burnt Hill Cattle Company. They were the ones that had the pigs and the sheep. Uh, and then also the Pasture Project is a really great organization that has a lot of great resources for regenerative grazing and rotational grazing. And then the Land Connection also has some really great resources for further information. Again, my name is Katie Bell, and this is my contact info. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to me.